Chapter 19, What Nightmares Dream Of, Part 2. Twilight frowned at these abnormalities. She was the only member of her family to have such traits, and one of the only few Saurosian ponies in Equestria to begin with. Even to this day, she got occasional, disapproving glances from the ponies she had dedicated her life to protecting. She was different. There was absolutely no hiding that, and she knew it. The black sheep of the royal family, a dark stain upon their perfect bloodline, according to some. The Saurosian Alicorn had long since learned to let these glances and words pass her by, but that didn't stop them from hurting all the same.
Princess Celine?
A voice spoke from the open door, the sound of her own name pulling Twilight back to the real world. The pony standing there was one of the many royal guards that she had come to know in the past several years. The unicorn's natural colors were overwritten by the enchantment of her own suit of armor, another difference between Twilight's set and the rest, appearing to have a snow-white coat and a solid blue mane and tail. Even still, Twilight recognized this pony from one unique feature: the silver fob watch dangling from her neck.
The ceremony is going to start soon.
The unicorn mare spoke nervously.
I was sent to collect you.
Twilight took a moment to regain her composure before offering the guard a kindly smile.
Thank you, but between you and I, you are out of uniform.
The unicorn guard looked confused for a moment before looking down at her accessory, gasping in surprise as she quickly tucked the watch safely away underneath her chest plate.
Ah! How did I forget that? I'm sorry, ow! It is fine. I'm not the one you should be worried about.
Twilight chuckled as she left her chambers with the unicorn following close behind.
In fact, you are quite lucky that I was the one to catch it. Otherwise, you might have gotten your family's heirloom confiscated. Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
The rest of the journey to the castle's frontmost courtyard was silent, leaving Twilight to her thoughts. Not that there was much to think of at the moment. All she had to do was stand up in front of the crowd of attending ponies and be quiet. She could do that in her sleep, eyes open and everything. Maybe she'd be asked to say a few words, or maybe even put the crown upon her sister's head. She didn't know. All that she knew was that all eyes would be upon her sister and her mother, as it should be on such a day. Finally, she arrived at the scene. The largest banquet hall in the castle had been cleared of most tables in favor of just a minor few, as the various nobles and royals of Equestria and a few allied countries all could be seen mingling and chatting amongst each other, with castle staff members roaming about with trays of drinks and those weird little sandwiches that Twilight would never understand. A few guests of note that Twilight noticed were a few ponies from the Crystal Empire to the north, as well as a number of Saurosians hailing from Ciara. Though the biggest standout was the single emissary from the distant nation of Minok, the lone minotaur wearing nothing but slacks and a bow tie as he awkwardly stood alone in the corner of the room. The before party had been set up in this venue as it had access to the balcony overlooking the castle's largest courtyard, where hundreds of bystanders were likely gathering for the event proper to begin. Twilight glanced about the room in search for someone to chat with and pass the time, noticing that the guard who had walked here with her had vanished, likely to get back to whatever assignment she'd been assigned earlier, as the royal guards were on high alert for the occasion. She earnestly considered walking over to the Minok emissary, just to hear whatever his wild story was, but the choice to do that was ripped away from her as she caught two unicorns approaching her. From the Crystal Empire, if their extravagant garb was to be believed. And much to her dismay, Twilight recognized these individuals. The first, the older-looking stallion, was none other than Emperor Mikaragio Rhapsodia of the Crystal Empire, a crimson-coated, well-built stallion who offered nothing but the kindest of smiles towards the Saurosian Alicorn. Then there was his accompanying daughter, Princess Miamore Melodia, Twilight's other older sister. While her eldest sibling, Celestia II, lived here in Equestria, Melodia was destined to be the future ruler of the Crystal Empire, and thus had made that kingdom her home. The resemblance she had to Celestia II, and by extension the trio's mother, was prevalent. In fact, if not for her pale pink coat and her bright pink mane, it would be very easy to mistake the second alicorn for this unicorn. "Oh, well, if it isn't Celine!" Rhapsodia bellowed with a great laugh, Twilight doing her best not to roll her eyes as the two stopped to chat with her. My, look how much you've grown! And that armor! Befitting of both a princess and a soldier, if I may say so.
Hello, Emperor Rhapsodia,
Twilight replied dryly. She moved her glance down towards her other sister.
Melodia, Celine.
The pink unicorn almost hissed back. While the relationship between Twilight and Celestia II had been one of mutual love and respect, with the occasional bouts of bickering as siblings did, her relationship with Melodia wasn't quite as civil, to put it kindly. "Oh, you don't have to be like that. I've already told you that you can call me father," Rhapsodia continued, either oblivious to the tension between the two mares, or just blatantly ignoring it. "You might not be my daughter by blood, but I do care for you and your well-being as a father should."
And the sentiment is appreciated,
Twilight lied back.
But I'm more comfortable with Emperor Rhapsodia if you would not mind.
The stallion gave a defeated grimace at that. "Could we at least compromise with just Rhapsodia?"
If you insist.
Twilight sighed.
Rhapsodia.
The Emperor was practically aglow from that exchange, trotting away with a spring in his step and humming a catchy tune. He was earnest in his desire to want to be a surrogate father, but that had also been his greatest undoing, as he was far too eager to fill the role. And frankly, it had only served to push Twilight away from him. But maybe this little compromise would get him to back off a bit. But as he began to chase down one of the sandwich servers, Twilight noticed that her sister had stayed behind.
You realize that this is a coronation, not one of your training exercises, right?
Melodia asked bitterly, glancing up and down at Twilight's armor with a judgmental gleam in her eyes. She then resumed eye contact with a bitterly sarcastic smile.
Or are you here to provide security? Because if that is the case, I think the guard over there could use a short break.
She pointed daintily at a distant member of the royal guard.
A chop-chop, soldier mare. Oh, is that jealousy I detect in your tone?
Twilight asked back with an equal amount of snark.
What? Still upset that you have to settle for cubic zirconium instead of real diamonds for that little tiara of yours?
The unicorn's taunting expression transformed into one of frustration. She looked around worriedly to check if anyone had heard the comment, before turning back with a hissing whisper.
You promised you would never speak of that again! And I was told you would promise to be civil today. By both our sister and our mother. Oh, it was just some sisterly teasing. Grow some thicker skin, said the pot to the kettle.
The Cerosian alicorn chuckled, much to the other princess's dismay.
Said the black sheep of the family, said the unloved middle child.
Twilight knew what game Melodia was playing at this point, but she was going to play along. Any excuse to get this unicorn to throw a tantrum. After all, if she caused too much of a ruckus, Twilight had the authority to legally detain her, and that would absolutely make her day, even if she would have to deal with her mother's consequences.
Said the would-be commoner. Said the spoiled brat. Said the knife-toothed freak!
Based on how her face had darkened from pink to red, it was clear that Melodia was done with this little game. She was so flustered, in fact, that she failed to notice that she had raised her voice a bit too high until it was far too late. She looked around, seeing that all eyes were now on her. There was no getting around it. Everyone had just heard that little outburst. Furious, she looked back to her younger sister. Twilight, with a triumphant smile, simply readjusted her wings and allowed a spark of silver to dance about her horn.
Said the unicorn,
she whispered, before simply walking away with a swish of her tail. While she didn't get to make the pink unicorn spend a night in the dungeon as she wanted, this outcome was far more enjoyable. Her little outburst was the only thing noticed by the others in attendance, and they didn't exactly appear to be pleased with her choice of words. The Sorosians in particular weren't a fan of the comment. She would be spending the rest of her evening struggling and squirming to undo her mistake. And struggling was the perfect word to describe it, especially when Twilight saw the mayor's father stomping back towards her. The pink unicorn only had enough time to mutter something about waiting for her coronation before her father's lecture was upon her. Oh, how Twilight was going to enjoy watching Melodia's backpedaling from afar. The only thing that could have made this better would have been if their mother had been present to witness it. And as she watched Melodia getting her ear chewed off by her father, Twilight could only imagine how the eldest alicorn would react, and it tickled her fancy to no end. She continued to wander about the room, occasionally stopping to speak with whoever it was who decided to try and speak with her. Just simple small talk, nothing more, nothing less. Not many of the discussions had been much of Twilight's interests, aside from a choice few. The Minnock emissary was more than happy to share his entire life story, and what a story it was. A grand tale of mammoth herding and sand shark hunting, a life that was truly worth living, in both his and Twilight's honest opinion. This was someone Twilight greatly enjoyed the company of, more so than the other stiffs at the party. Speaking of, the Ciaran representatives were also amongst those she decided to speak with. And this was when she learned that her actual father would not be in attendance this evening. Something that Twilight found herself feeling indifferent about. The old bat never left his domicile unless the event in question had something to do with him, and this occasion did not meet those standards. But, if nothing else, it meant that Twilight wouldn't be getting a little sister anytime soon.
Unless Mother Dearest decides to fancy another suitor.
She shuddered at the thought, especially considering the fact that it was a very real possibility. Doubly so, seeing how the mayor was ready to retire. The clamor and commotion that floated about the room was quickly cut silent as the elaborate doors were once again swung open. All eyes turned to the entrance and the two alicorns that strode into the room. The first was Princess, and soon-to-be Queen, Celestia II, wearing a beautifully elaborate gown of reds and golds, crafted specifically for this occasion. She was radiant, even if she fought to conceal just how overwhelmingly nervous she was. Even from this distance, Twilight could see her sister shaking like a leaf.
Seems even she can't escape the power of stage fright.
She chuckled to herself, partaking in one of the martinis as a service mare walked past.
Ugh. How can these things be so expensive yet taste so terrible?
The second mare to walk through, however, was far more confident than her daughter. A moment's glance was enough to see the family resemblance between Celestia II and her mother was strong, to the point where you could mistake the princess for a younger variation of the queen, and vice versa. From the perfectly carved features of their faces to the colors of their coats, there were only two distinct ways to tell the two apart. The first was their eyes. Whereas Celestia II's were of a violet complexion, her mother's were a brilliant scarlet. The second and more distinctive way were their manes. Twilight's sister had a mane colored like brilliant golden flames that gave off a small aura of light akin to that of the sun. It was a beautiful and stunning sight to see in person, one that could never be replicated. But their mother? Hers was an entirely different story. If Twilight's mane could be called silver, and Celestia II's gold, then the Queen's was, without question, platinum. Beautiful, ever-flowing locks of flawless hair colored in the same way as the rarest of the precious metals. And like her daughters, her mane also had a certain glow about it. The platinum threads glistened and shined with the complete color spectrum, creating a rainbow aura about the Queen that was beyond description. Queen Sanctus Solus Celestia I was truly a sight to behold. She stood there, observing the guests of this little soiree with the kind of look that only a respected queen and a proud mother could. That expression wavered when she saw her middle child getting a lecture from her father off in one corner of the room, but she didn't seem to pay it much mind outside of noticing it. Instead, she simply cleared her throat, a powerful sound that hushed all in the room who had not already given her and her eldest their undivided attention. Afterward, the soon-to-be former Queen of Equestria began to speak, mostly thanking the VIPs for attending, both the before party and the main event soon to follow, and expressing her hopes for future prosperity and cooperation between all nations. Twilight, of course, had heard this little song and number before. Her mother had been practicing this routine, as well as her address to the people that would follow shortly, for weeks now. One would think that after 400 years of ruling a country that she'd be better at public speaking, but as the evidence suggested, it was still something that the eldest alicorn still had anxieties about. And as a result of that, the two daughters that lived with her in Equestria had been made to hear these very speeches many times over, giving them both an excuse to pay attention to other matters. For Twilight, that meant trying to find something to clean the taste of martini out of her mouth. For Celestia II, it meant trying to down as many of those martinis as she reasonably could to drown the anxiety radiating off of her like light off of the sun. It wouldn't be long now before the coronation proper had begun. It was scheduled to coincide with the rising of the sun. The first sunrise of a new era, as their mother had put it. She had always been one for the theatrics. The status quo was re-established quickly once the Queen's second-to-last speech as the nation's queen concluded, now with the two alicorns being the central focus of attention and conversation. So much so that hardly anybody noticed as the Saurosian emissaries began to distance themselves from the crowd, save for the ever-vigilant Twilight, that is. 4 representatives from Ciara had arrived in total, 2 guards and 2 members of the King's Court, and now each of them was slowly marching towards one of the 4 corners of the spacious room.
That seems peculiar.
Twilight kept her watchful eye on them as they continued to spread out. Something was definitely wrong with them, however, as they moved in a very unnatural manner. Stiff, puppet-like, like they weren't even ponies at all. And then, upon reaching their destinations, the 4 ponies simply turned and stood at attention, their gazes fixated forwards, unblinking. Curious for this behavior, Twilight cautiously made her way over to one of the transfixed individuals.
Excuse me, but what are you and your comrades doing?
The Saurosian alicorn was given no answer. In fact, the other nocturnal pony gave no sign that they had even heard her question at all. He simply stood there, staring forward without any sign that they were even still conscious.
Excuse me, I'm speaking to you. It would be wise to...
This time, she was given an answer, but not one Twilight would have liked. The stallion's eyes flashed brightly with an unnatural white light, before continuing to glow with a less intense, but still ominous pale glow. If she could see the other three at this moment, she'd have been mortified to know that they had undergone the exact same change. And then, the four Sarosians spoke in unison, impossibly loud for such a minor amount of ponies. But stranger still was the number of voices that called out. Where there should have been only 4, instead, there were so many more. Uncountable, even. Salutati Coro. Each of the Ciaran representatives left their mouths agape after that, hissing as thick streams of black smoke began to flow outward. Twilight was the first to be caught up in it, coughing and hacking as the horrid substance penetrated her lungs. She could do nothing as the room was enveloped, the dark smog eliminating all ability to see. And as the shadows continued to swirl and stir about the spacious room, an unnaturally chilled gale found its way in, which served to diminish the ability to hear as well. But that didn't stop the screams of confusion and fear from the partygoers from being heard. If anything, it only encouraged them, especially when the crackles of arcane lightning began. Whatever was behind this was a powerful force of magic, that much was clear. Twilight was quick in her attempt to try and stop this, thinking that maybe if she stopped one of the Sarosians, that it would diminish this horrid effect. But despite restraining the stallion with her magic, the other 3 simply increased their efforts, which more than made up for the sudden lack of their comrade. The tragedy that followed happened far too quickly for anyone to stop. As the winds continued to howl and the black smoke continued to swirl, a pattern could be seen within the unnatural phenomenon. A cyclone. A pillar of pitch blackness had formed around Equestria's queen. Whatever was going on, she was the sole target. And noticing this, the first alicorn took immediate action. A powerful, multicolored burst of light spread throughout the room in an instant from her horn, disrupting the shadows for but only a moment. But the seemingly useless countermeasure had succeeded in its purpose, getting everyone else in the room away from the queen. Before she could take any further action, the room was silenced by the sickening sound of flesh being torn by cold steel. It was only then that the 4 representatives ceased their dark ritual. Their eyes returned to normal, and the smoke stopped flowing, just in time for them to pass out. Whatever it was they had just done had taken a great deal out of them, rendering them unable to even remain conscious. With the source of the chaos gone, it was not long before the unnatural storm began to clear. The winds were silenced, the lightning faded, and the black veil that had been cast about the room began to disperse. All eyes were locked onto the spot where the queen once stood, watching with wide eyes and bated breath in fearful anticipation. Standing in the shallow crater was not her mother, but a single coal-coated Sarosian who had not been there moments prior. His black mane was tattered and jagged like a sinister dark flame, his body covered in small patches of onyx crystals protruding from his flesh, one of which sat at the right spot on his head to mimic a twisted and jagged unicorn horn. Dark iron armor decorated his body where crystals did not, and a heavy-looking crimson cape was draped over his shoulders. Twilight had seen this individual before. Just about everyone in attendance knew who this was. Though he had undergone a few changes since they last saw him, this stallion was undoubtedly King Sombra of Ciara. It seemed Twilight's father had decided to attend after all. He stood there while taking slow, raspy breaths. His crimson eyes were wide with exertion and exhilaration as unnatural tendrils of dark magic flared and whipped from their sockets. As he gazed down at his hooves, a slow smile began to form on his lips. It began with a slow chuckle, but soon it transitioned into full-blown cackles of madness. It was a horrific sound in of itself, even more so when one considered what it touched his fancy. For laying there at his hooves was Queen Princess Celestia I, unmoving and unbreathing. Her mane had fallen flat, losing the lustrous rainbow aura that floated about it. A puddle of red began to slowly form and expand around where the fallen queen lay, flowing from a point where her throat met the large and jagged metal knife that had been buried deep within. And aside from Sombra's manic laughing, all in attendance were just as silent as the corpse he stood over. It is just as they said. Sombra blared out between his bouts of insane laughter. There is no such thing as a true immortal. Not even you. Twilight looked on in utter disgust and horror, unable to act and unable to pry her eyes away from the lifeless form of her mother. Her body refused to move. Her breaths were short and haggard, and her mind couldn't possibly comprehend what it was she was even looking at. This couldn't be real, could it? Celestia I was an alicorn. She was meant to be immortal, unable to leave the mortal realm by any means, yet there she was, dead, on the ground, like a common slain beast. And standing right above her was the monster that had managed to do it. But as Sombra continued to revel in his triumph, Twilight was approached by a new sound that drowned out Sombra's victorious laughter. It came from everywhere and nowhere. The sound of her own voice. No, it wasn't her voice she was hearing. It had never been her voice in the first place. It was the voice of Princess Celine, the alicorn who she had been masquerading as for what felt like a lifetime, accompanied by hundreds of other voices all speaking at the same time. A sound that Twilight had come to know very well within the past few days of her real life.
Where did you learn to dreamwalk?
And with that, Twilight was abruptly awoken from this horrible nightmare.